Okay, I think we can get started with introductions here. My name is Beth Fisher Yoshida, and I am the Program Director of the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program at Columbia University, and our nickname is NECR. And today I have a wonderful guest with me, Flynn Coleman, and I will give her a proper introduction in a few minutes. But before we get to that, I just want to go to the next slide, please, and let people know we have some other events coming up, always lots of events. And you see there's a QR code if you want to register for these. On Saturday, we have our spring capstone presentations, which are on campus in person. So if you would like to attend those, please look at the QR code and register. It is the culminating activity of our students, and they have some wonderful projects that they present with their conflict analysis and recommendations for intervention. So I hope to see you there. And then for our monthly webinar next month, we have Imaging Peace, Photography, Peace Building, and Conflict Transformation with Dr. Tiffany Ferry, and that will be virtual, just like today's is. And that's on, it says April 18th, but that should not be, that's May. It should be May 9th, so that will be checked afterwards. But with the QR code, you'll be able to get there and know the correct date and register for it accordingly. Okay, so then now I can move into, one more thing I wanted to say too for housekeeping. If you're interested in the program, which I hope you are, and you want to learn more, please stay on after we finish our webinar series, and David Taylor-Tamilty will be here to answer your questions and give you some information about the whole admissions process to the NECR program. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce my guest today, Flynn Coleman. Now, if I were to really talk about everything that Flynn does and all her accolades, I would be taking up the whole hour, which is not what I want to do. I want to get to us having a conversation, but I am going to say some of the highlights that I pulled out. And one of the things that's very interesting about what Flynn does is she's working in areas that are very hot topics right now. I mean, we're always talking about AI, we're talking about humanitarian issues and so on. And she works at the intersection of a lot of those. She's an author, an international human rights attorney, an environmental advocate, and also professor. She has a recent book called A Human Algorithm, which we will talk about more, but it is a narrative on the urgency of humanely designed AI, which I think we're all concerned about, and a guidebook to reimagining life in the era of intelligent technology. She has many titles, but right now, and I hope I get all of them, she's the Fernand Browder Senior Fellow in the Department of Law at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. She's a visiting researcher at the University of Copenhagen in the law faculty and a fellow at the Information Society Law Center at the University of Milan, the Cesare Beccaria Department of Legal Sciences. She's lived in many countries, she speaks 7 languages, and she's written and spoken on many topics, including war crimes, genocide, truth and reconciliation commissions, behavioral science, and political reconciliation. Basically, what it means to be human and what it means to be humane. So, Flynn, welcome to today's webinar.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here, and I'm delighted to be with everyone in this space at this incredibly important time, and so it's my pleasure.
Thank you. And another reminder that as we're going through our conversation, we also welcome audience members to please write in their questions in the Q&A box. We may not get to the Q&A until the end, but we will try to anyway. I wanted to start our conversation by talking about your book, A Human Algorithm, and congratulations on the book. I mean, publishing a book is not easy. It's a big commitment, and I know that it's not only the writing of the book, but everything that happens afterwards to get that book out into the marketplace. So what do you, what?
As you would know well.
I know, it's quite an accomplishment. Not that I'm saying I've done the accomplishment, I'm giving you the kudos. So what do you hope to achieve through the publication of this book, A Human Algorithm?
Yes, it's such an interesting question, because having kind of been working at the intersection of technology and artificial intelligence and human rights and things like democracy that we'll get into, I've of course seen such an evolution. I mean, when I first started working and talking about these topics, I would get the gamut from these two things are absolutely not connected to what do you even mean to this isn't a problem. So to kind of be in this space, you know, when you said in your introduction, well, we're going to talk about ethical AI, it's everywhere. It wasn't always so easy to even suggest that this was something so urgent. And so to make a very, very long story short, what I wanted to do was to provide a human perspective to these issues. And like you, I've long been working at the intersection of many things. And for me, that's included humanitarian issues, human rights, the future of democracy and authoritarianism, and how we move forward from atrocity, from war crimes, genocide. Those are the types of things I've been thinking about. And so in a way, I fell into this because I had been looking at technology, starting with things like satellite imagery. And so before we were even talking about AI, we were talking about things like, how do we see evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity? How do we, for example, use satellite imagery to detect evidence of a burnt out village or a mass grave? And even when we succeeded in this kind of incredible feat at the time, negotiating to get access to the satellite, seeing what had happened, even when we succeeded at this very kind of cutting edge technological feat, using it for human rights use, I remember thinking, but everyone's already dead and gone. We need to be able to do more. And we need to be able to creatively and innovatively think about how we're saving lives and how we're bringing humanity to this. So, kind of down the algorithmic rabbit hole I went, starting thinking about not just technology, but how we can use it for good and to become kind of like the work that you do, to become closer to each other and to treat each other better and to collaborate on all the issues of today, as opposed to all the forces trying to pull us apart. So the idea was to create that human perspective, because the most important thing is that we all should have a voice in the future being built for all of us. And that is currently not the case. It's very isolated and very siloed. So I wanted to bring this human approach and to remind people that we should all have a say and we're all a part of this. And so these tools should be for all of us, for the common good. And how can they bring us together?
Yeah, interesting. I wasn't even thinking about just going back to what almost seems like old-fashioned compared to AI, like satellite imagery, right? To get things, but actually 2D, 3D, all of that satellite imagery to really see what's happening. So you're talking about bringing us back to our humanity, being humane, and then you also talk about aligning our human values. And I just wanted you to expand on that a little bit, like what values are you talking about?
Yeah, I love this question. And I think it gets to the heart of a bunch of what we're talking about, because I detail this in my book. And I think one of the things working on AI is that I'm a human rights lawyer. And so I work on these concepts of what does it mean to heal from war? How do we come together as individuals, as families, communities, societies after the worst thing that could happen? And so I'm always thinking about how are we creating these laws and policies and that connective tissue to really bind us as a society. And it's often a question I get, okay, so if we agree that we need to shape technology with values, for example, or even government policies, those types of things, well, then one of the questions is, well, then which values, whose values? And Isaiah Berlin talks about this concept, and it's a philosophical concept that we can never reconcile values. For example, this concept of freedom with equality. And these are the types of things that are happening in every geopolitical sphere, in every human rights issue. So in that way, someone like me, I have a comfort level with the deep uncertainty of what that means. But I think what happens is we say, well, this is going to be hard. So as a result, we stop trying. And we say, well, we can never reconcile these values because we go into a different culture and things are different. And so how could we possibly do this? And we're in this huge kind of chasm right now, great power competition, and even just within our own communities. So what happens is we say, yes, it's hard, but then we stop. So for me, the idea is we're always striving to have more what David White calls courageous conversations, what you do in your work and in your program. So yes, these things can feel really irreconcilable, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to treat each other better and to think about what having a moral or ethical compass means, however short we fall. And so these are the types of things that I think about, and I kind of delineate in the book some ideas for how we might do this. One example being, and again, it's very wonderful to see that this is much more accepted now. But when I was first writing about this, I suggested the International Human Rights Framework as a place to start when we're thinking about technology and AI. Again, it's a little more kind of common now, but at the time, this was not something people were thinking about. So, AI is new in a sense, so the concept is much older than we think, but social justice advocacy, human rights advocacy, these are not new things. And so we're going to need to update a lot of what we do for the technological age and kind of the cutting edge, fast pace of how the tools are developing. But the concept that we are all as human beings equally and intrinsically valuable that came out of World War II is not that new. And so it doesn't mean that we get there, but it means we strive to treat each other. And then if you're talking to me, I'm getting a little bit more radical, and the world around us as something worthy of saving and equally intrinsically valuable.
Great. And as you're talking about values, I'm thinking about, okay, so one is that we might have the same values, but we may recognize them and act on them differently. So or we may not have the same values. And then if we don't recognize the existence of the other, we don't recognize what's valuable to them either. We just sort of dismiss that. So you have how do you operationalize the values? And then from different cultural perspectives, there are different ways of doing that. So can you say a little bit about how to have that civil discourse about that topic?
That's such a beautiful way of putting it. And I agree. And it's a very nuanced topic. But as you said, there's, okay, agreeing that we want this policy or this law or this concept to have this. And then how do we execute, enforce, implement? And then, as you said, there's that other piece of, okay, so we come from different places, different backgrounds, different cultural values. How are we coming together in the same physical or metaphorical space to figure that out and make space for all of us? And I think, of course, like you, there's no easy answers to any of these questions. But I think that, on the one hand, we look at history. So we're going to need a lot of new things, but history shows us a lot of what we've done, for example, with nuclear disarmament or chemical weapons bans or the Atomic Energy Commission or a peace process that went well. And how did things go well and how did things, go not so well? And so I think that we have the historical past, but then we have to be thinking about the future and even the future generations. And then in terms of culture, I think this is so critical because from a human rights perspective, like many governments and institutions around the world, for the most part, we are different. And to celebrate like the vast prism of our diversity and our differences is part of being human. We're so multifaceted. There's so many dimensions to all of us. And I think for people, especially, for what I do, for me, it's about bringing the most marginalized and the most vulnerable to the center and thinking about celebrating kind of the vast humanity of who we all are, as opposed to just, who is mainstream, had most of the rights or had most of the power. So it's an issue of power. But from a human rights perspective, we also understand that however deep and beautiful and complex our differences, there are some things that we all deserve, no matter who we are and where we come from. And I do this whether I'm teaching a class or whether I'm in a room, and you do, I know from your incredible work, you do something similar. So we come from these different backgrounds, experiences. We all have biases and prejudice. That's another key piece. There is no one of us that's a blank slate. So we recognize our majesty, but also our flaws, our fallibility, all the ways that we fail. And we say we're all imperfect, incredibly different, but there are things in this room we can do together that we can't do alone. And I think about things, for example, like the James Webb Space Telescope and how it took thousands and thousands of scientists from all around the world building on the work of others to launch a giant honeycomb into space. And now we are seeing 13 billion years back in time. This is what we're capable of when we work together. Because I think part of what you're getting at, what I think about is individually, we are so small and we are so fragile. But together, if we can find that third space, that space where we can connect, I don't think there's a star we can't dream of exploring. So I love that question. And I know it speaks to your work too.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, great stuff. So you're talking about getting people together, and I see the word communication coming up, right? And so communication also is about communication online and through artificial intelligence and so on. And of course, now we have the surgence of Chat GPT, which everybody's talking about Chat GPT. So I wanted to get your take on it also about, you talked about biases, right? And so if we're putting things in to machine learning, then it's going to have our biases in there. Although I've also heard different people talking about how machines learn so much faster than humans, so they're going to go beyond. So if you can just expound a little bit on ChatGPT and the humanity of it.
Yes, so there's so much in there, and it's interesting and fascinating because when my first book came out, I talked a lot about, this is pre-ChatGPT, talking a lot about storytelling and narrative and how kind of the best idea of something like the internet would be, this Alexandria's library where we all have a library card and we all get to come together. But of course, that promise and idea is not how things turned out. And ChatGPT, it's been in the works for a while, but I think part of what makes it a bit of a tipping point is it's one of the first instances where the public could interact in natural language without programming or coding with these tools. So some of us working in the space, we've been thinking about this, but suddenly this was in the public eye. And I'm based partially in New York and partially in Italy. And Italy was interesting because it was the first to kind of ban ChatGPT immediately, but then very quickly kind of rolled that back. And so you have all these different responses to this tool, but essentially with natural language, you can start to interact with these artificially intelligent systems. So people said, okay, wait, on the one hand, okay, it's a glorified Google. On the other hand, this is just the version 1.0. We are going to be stepping into something with video, images, everything from deep fakes to a whole new kind of scope of what we can do. And then, of course, in the university system, the educational system, this has opened up an entire Pandora's box, right, of what we should do and how. And so, in the book and in my work, I talk about this in a sense, the starting point is that technology is something we tend to think of, especially digital technology, like the fancy new tools we have. But fire is technology. Celestial navigation is technology. Irrigation is technology. The point is, we have been building and evolving alongside our tools and technology since the beginning of human history. This iteration feels strange and amazing and scary for a lot of reasons. Number one, because of the hockey stick-like growth of technology. So part of technology is that part of the issue we're having now is not that we're building new things. We've always done that. And we've always struggled to assimilate, right? So Henry Ford, for the very complex person that he was, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said, I want a faster horse. So, right, so we've always kind of had trouble assimilating, but normally we have much more time to get used to these tools. The difference here is that the acceleration is so fast, the human mind is not nearly able to evolve and to cope in the speed and the scale of what's happening. And so this is kind of one of the things that sets it apart. And then the other thing that sets apart something like an AI, ChatGPT, is the existential idea that we are building something potentially smarter than we are or could ever be. For me, this is an existential crisis. We have always placed ourselves at the top of the hierarchy. And we tend to think of the human mind as the holy grail. Now, my book gets a little bit more revealing of my secret agenda, which is that what if we didn't think of the human mind as the only holy grail? What if we made room for more and more of us? And the reason I think about that is because that's what human rights is at the end of the day, right? It's that women get to be a part of things, whereas we weren't able to vote. Marginalized communities, we get to be a part of things. This is the history of who we are, is, as Albert Schweitzer calls it, creating more and more space for the crucible of humanity. So ChatGPT is a research assistant. It's terrifying for professors. It's being used in creating presentations. It's making us realize that we are fragile and that things are always changing. So for me, the point is technology is here, whether you love it or you hate it. For me, it's like, let's get to work. All I want to know is how do we use this for good, whether you hate it or you love it. It's here. And because there are others in the fight, more nefarious forces or a resurgence of authoritarianism or warfare, drone swarms, these people are all using these tools, so we need to too. And ChatGPT, again, is kind of opened up to realize we can be in partnership with these tools for better or for worse. So I think one thing to answer your question is, how can we use these tools in like a more harmonious partnership where we can get rid of some of the mundane and busy work that has maybe taken up a lot of our very overloaded minds and leaving us more space like to dream, to explore, and to imagine. And that's my hope for the best of us with technology, as opposed to taking shortcuts or allowing for more bloodshed and more war. But pretending it doesn't exist and either fully banning it and never exploring it or letting it run our lives is not where the answer lies. It lies in a piece of kind of collaboration between us and machines, and not just on kind of the speaking end when we speak to our computers via ChatGPT. It's who gets to fund this stuff, who gets to build it, who gets to be in the room when we decide how these tools are going to be built.
Yeah, and it's so you have that continuum in two extremes where it's like ban or just free for all, just no restrictions, but everything in between. And I know that we think about some of the uncharted or unmanaged discussions that happen online, and because everything is so immediate and so quickly and so widespread that sometimes, I don't know if people, well, I think a lot of people are intentional in saying things that aren't nice and so on, and people get misaligned and so on. So talked about the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, and that there was a lot of negative talk about her online. She's a public figure, and I think that we can see what's happening in the world today with people wanting to be in politics or wanting to be public figures and maybe thinking twice about it because it just exposes so much of who they are and not always nice, and then it affects them and their families and everything else. So there's this really fine line about all of that. And so what do you think about people who are from more vulnerable populations, including women, being public figures, and then how do we manage the whole online portrayal of who they are and the communication that happens?
What a great question. Yeah, and so much of what you spoke about, when you were saying, well, people are dissuaded from running. And then I'm thinking, of course, well, it's not generally speaking all people, it's women, it's people of marginalized communities, it's people who know they're going to be attacked. Any woman online generally understands that it's a complete minefield. Any woman walking down the street understands that life is a complete minefield, right? And so I think that these are the things that help us understand something really, really critical. And the concept of the internet or of social media or the branding of it as this tool to bring us together, this utopian ideal, is whether or not we could build it, it's not what we have built. We have built this concept within a capitalist system that is focused on a few tech titans becoming rich beyond anyone's wildest dreams, selling us something. So if you don't pay for the product, you are the product. We are the product. And the critical thing, again, understanding that we have measures we can take, is that the algorithm is not here to connect you to your friends. It is here to sell you something because it has been designed with the quarterly report profit-based system that built it. And again, what we do with this, we still have time to make some changes, but that's really, really important. So the algorithm is feeding you content not to help make your life better, but to sell someone an ad, to keep your eyeballs, that precious last bastion of your intention. So, and this is something that's very important because people say, well, is AI listening in, through my listening device, Siri or whatever? And I say, well, it has capability, but it doesn't need to. It doesn't need to listen to you because it takes the aggregate data, this algorithm that people from the best engineering schools in the entire world will train their entire lives to do this. It takes the aggregate data of people of your similar demographic, similar desires, that psychologists are hired to do this, to kind of tap into your deepest insecurities and desires. And so it feeds you that pair of shoes online because it knows you better than you know yourself in that way. It's preying on those parts of ourselves. And that's really important because it doesn't mean we don't use these tools, because in a sense, to not use them is to not opt into society. There are some communities, as you know, around the world that we require WhatsApp to create our social activism. We require these tools, but it's important to understand that as they're currently designed, algorithms are designed to make money. And what makes money is sensationalist, extremist content. So the other thing you're hearing online is not necessarily this majority voice of civic discussion. It's a cacophony of the most extreme voices, because that's how money is made, by tapping into that part of ourselves. And so I think that that's really important to recognize and to remember. And it's not that there are easy fixes to this, but to understand that it's kind of preying on those instinctual tendencies, those tendencies to only feel comfortable around our group, our own in-group, for example, to feel less empathy for outsiders. You had mentioned this, to look away from other people's cultures and focus only on our own needs. And so that's, I think, a very important, scary piece of this, and why, of course, for example, as you said, women don't want to run for office because, or when they do, they find that it's such a loud kind of screaming void of hate. And that hate exists. It's all, my work is based in the worst things we can do to each other, but that's not all that exists. It's just, that's not, I always say, like, it's so hard to hear your voice in the crowd, especially today. And so how do we create tools that help us find our voice and connect with others? And I think that, this understanding of what algorithms are is important, but also that there is another way to do this. And you discuss civic discourse and you discuss those things. There are also some incredible organizations countering hate and extremism, bringing us together online. These are possibilities too.
Yeah, so it's really interesting when you talk about the original intent and framing of the algorithms, how they're written, what their real purpose is in the guise of social media. So when we think about social, it's a little bit misleading when you think about it, it's really to sell you something, and then you have all these platforms talking about like ads and charging more money for ads, but it is a profit-making machine. So wow. Okay, not so social, social media. So then, we've been talking a lot about what happens. So because it goes online and because it has global reach and because it's so immediate and they try to put restrictions on they, meaning the social media people, try to put restrictions on things, but really it's also the challenge and the struggle between free speech and then having that. Then I'm just curious, what's your take on the increase of polarization? And I ask myself, is it really increasing, or is it that we just know about it more because it's more apparent, right, because of the social media? But what's your take on polarization and the role technology plays in all of that?
Yeah, again, this is essential. I mean, we have in 2024 alone, I talk a lot about this, and I recently spoke about the future of AI and democracy in this election year. We have over 60 countries going to the polls. We have billions of people. The majority of the world's population is going to the polls this year. This is a monumental year for deciding the future of leadership globally. And, what do I think about that? I think that I'm very concerned about, as you said, the profit motive that is going on, and the data. The data around polarization is very interesting. There's some interesting work being done on this because, as you said, on the one hand, what we hear online is very different. The loudest voices online that go viral, get the most clicks, is not indicative of society writ large. I mean, there's many examples, hot button issues in the US, from gun control to abortion, where people agree a lot more, generally speaking. I'm not saying we agree on exactly everything, but generally speaking, for example, those are some places in the US where people agree a lot more than you would see online. And generally, when people are in a room together, I mean, you know this so well, and we're making eye contact and we're having to work together and we understand that we need to live alongside each other, we have that instinctual urge to work together. I mean, I've done some research myself on, because I think war is one of my specialties. And I think about, are we a human society that was kind of born and bred in war? But I also think a lot of our survival actually wasn't of the fittest. And some of the archaeological and historical research is showing was based on things like collaboration and friendship and working together. And so I think on the one hand, polarization is extremely real. And every generation probably does this. It feels as, it's the most polarized that it's been. And I do think some of that rings true in the sense that extremism online, again, there's nothing new about extremism. There is nothing new about hate and vitriol, but the speed and the scale with which you can spread, and with, an 8-year-old child watching YouTube, and then they click, and then what it does is the algorithm clicks them more and more towards extremist content. So you start relatively in the middle, let's say, but every video auto-played clicks more and more extreme. And there's something very visceral about this sensationalist extremism. And this is before, when you're a kid, your brain hasn't fully formed. And if you're spending more and more time online, I mean, there's new studies, some people, I think kids in the US, I think the number was 4.8 hours a day on social media. So these numbers are enormous. And again, I don't like to say things so black and white, because there are incredible things that come from when you can look at a piece of art, even when you can't afford to go to that museum across the world. You can look on, like, this is an incredible idea. So I think polarization on the one hand is part of who we are, to think in these binary terms, because our human brain has to make, the adult human brain has to make some 35,000 decisions every single day just to get out of bed, get your breakfast, walk down the street. Your body and your mind have to make so many decisions. So we use what are called mental shortcuts, heuristics. So this is where assumptions come from. This is why eyewitness testimony is terrible, especially across things like race, because our brain could not take in all of that information without creating these shortcuts. But they can become so problematic because then we make a shortcut. This person's in my group, this person's outside of my group. And so then we get this binary way of thinking, and it takes work to think on a spectrum and to think in that broader way. But at the same time, if you go offline in the real spaces where we have to live, people are collaborating. I mean, my work in genocide also, has showed that there is not just one model for justice, as you know well. We can think about reconciliation. We have not perfected this by any sense of the word, but we can think about what it means not just to hate each other, but how do we come back and live together? So I think technology it's exacerbating these things, but it's also giving us a false sense of the fullness of who we are as human communities. That being said, there is no choice not to use the internet now in terms of where we are as a society. At the same time, there's a huge majority of people that don't even have reliable internet access yet. So it's not just about the fancy new tools and ChatGPT. There are some people that aren't connected at all. So I think what you do and what I do is we're thinking about how are we bringing this civil discourse into these places where we understand we're coming from different places, but we have this one fragile planet, and how do we take care of it together? And there's some great research being done on polarization, but I think it's interesting, and I'd be curious your take too, that at the end of the day, all politics is local. We're coming together, one person, one town hall at a time. And how do we do that?
Yeah, one of our colleagues, Peter Coleman, has a book, The Way Out, which talks about increasing polarization and is doing some work on that. And in our work and looking at complexity, I think what happens is that you're talking about the brain and how we do all these shortcuts and everything else. We get so overwhelmed by the complexity of our lives and the complexity of conflict and how to deal with things and all of that, that we do get very binary, very black and white, only because I think we're so stressed, and under that feeling of stress, what really happens on our brain is things just shut down and we want to go to the simplest thing possible. Is this safe or not? Like black and white, yes or no, what is it? But then when we do that, and we talk about this in the program as well, we lose the ability to see all the other shades of gray that are, and all the other possibilities that are there. And then we lose that space for creativity, for intervention. And that's the problem. So when people stay polarized, then you also thinking about the internet and access to information. So you're right, a lot of people don't have access, don't have reliable access. And then a lot of times people choose the access they want, which typically are the voices that mirror their own feelings, which become deeper and deeper, more exacerbated. You know, the expression, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. Like you want to know what other points of view, or I want to know, not everybody, but I want to know alternative points of view. And I have to say, sometimes I'm really impressed and then also scared that I'm like, wow, that's really a strong argument for a point of view that I don't believe in, but the way it's presented is so convincing, and the evidence they've gathered, again, data is selective. What do we choose to pay attention to? What do we not? And then what are we just naturally not even choosing? It's not a conscious choice. And it reinforces the stories that we have. So with all of that, which sounds so dismal, but I am a very optimistic person. How can we, and what are your ideas about moving people towards the middle, away from those extreme polarized places?
Yeah, and I think, you encapsulated it in a really beautiful way. I was smiling because there's a part of my book where I talk about this concept of swimming in the gray. And there is so much magic and civil discourse and hope to be found there. I also think about, I've taught a course on how to have better conversations, which is very similar, right, to thinking about negotiation and conflict resolution, and kind of the starting point that I always think about with this concept of conversation. One of my favorite classes I ever taught was that, and you'll instinctually, of course, know this as well, as that there's what I say in a conversation with you, there's what you hear and you say, and then the conversation, though, is that space we create that's neither fully me nor fully you. It's that space in between. And those are physical spaces, those are metaphorical, online, now they're digital spaces. And that's where the magic happens. And it isn't always pretty, and it isn't always clear. But, at the best, this concept of the public square, this concept of civil discourse, of collaboration, there's something about recognizing that, because in that, you see yourself in the other sees himself in you, and recognize there's this whole other thing that we can create together. And I think one of the key answers to your question, again, no easy answers in this work, is that, and I talk about this in my book and my work, and I think about this more and more because, I'm based here in Italy, and my humanities education has given me as much as my legal and other education about this concept of social imagination. And we can't imagine a better or brighter future without that capacity, which is why, I talk a lot in my book about storytelling and books and literature and poetry and art and the things that help us imagine what isn't quite here yet. Because we have history, we have maybe things that have worked and haven't, but the incredible thing about being human is our capacity to imagine. You cannot build a skyscraper, New York City, without this or bridge without this capacity to imagine what could be. And when we're thinking about scenario building or futures, we think about these multiple different scenarios, and there isn't just one, right? There are multiple different scenarios that we could have. So moving us forward requires this incredibly complex thing, because again, the human brain is extremely flawed, and there is so much we don't know. That's the other thing about kind of trying to create an AI model in the human brain. There's so much we don't know. We don't exactly know even why we dream or how we process memories. We don't exactly know why, so much, but it is arguably the most magnificent creation, in all of biological history. So that is the thing that is what we can use to move forward. And I think it requires understanding that yes, the internet could have been this and it wasn't, or the founding documents of a government were like this, and this beautiful idea has not turned out this way in practice, or we've made enormous, horrifying mistakes in the past. But that doesn't mean we can't imagine a better future. And I think that is kind of the starting point, is having this moral, social, ethical imagination. And I do think that some of the problems of today, whether it's democratic decline, climate, AI, the possibility of nuclear warfare, have also moved us out of this any pretense that we are not deeply interconnected, right? And maybe way back in the day, you might have met 100 people in your whole life. Now, for better or for worse, we're comparing ourselves to others, which is of course wreaking havoc, especially on populations like young girls. But we also have this capacity to learn and to grow. And so I think coming together and having that civil discourse, those courageous conversations, and allowing that they are going to be messy is important. I have a teacher who wasn't an academic teacher, but another kind of teacher that is a friend, that said something to me once. It's like one of those things someone says to you in passing and then you never forget it. and she said to me, so wise, and she said to me, can you think about not categorizing everything as right or wrong and find a much more interesting way to think about things? And there's a kind of Rumi said something similar, which is out beyond the fields of right doing, out beyond the areas of right doing and wrong doing, there's a field, I'll meet you there. And I love this for negotiation. I love this for collaboration. I love this for human rights. Like when we're talking about values, what is more interesting than just right or wrong, binary categories? And I think the digital literacy is, of course, important. Education, civic education, these types of things are very important. So many incredible things, for example, happening even at the other levels that we don't often give credence to, the community college level, thinking about new ways that we are infusing this concept of how we come together. I read an article, it was yesterday, about thinking about how we connect with strangers. And not just those strong ties between people we know well, but the quote unquote weaker ties. Something in Italy we do all the time, just that opportunity to connect with someone different and to feel this like simultaneously how we're so the same, but that we're so different, and we can celebrate both of those things. So that being said, I think your work is a perfect example of what we're doing to come together and figure out the messy work of collaborating. And the James Webb Space Telescope I think about a lot, because that's not something any individual could do, but together, we are seeing back to the beginning of time. So
Amazing. Yeah. So when you said the social imagination, I was always thinking also of Jean Paul Lederach's work and his book, The Moral Imagination. So the whole idea about imagination, and he does talk about the arts. And I know that in my work in Colombia, I work a lot with different artistic communities. And the whole idea about being in that space is so freeing and liberating, in the sense of liberating from your own mind and your own mindset and your own way of seeing things. And then we're talking about, my next question is going to be about social change. And I'm thinking about when we do some systemic mapping and you talk about like, okay, so we don't always know all the things that are going to happen in a system, any kind of systemic change. But when you start to implement something, then it could have no effect, but then later have a very big effect because you're not seeing it yet because it's latent, or you could start to see the change. So even if you're strategic at the beginning and doing your planning and preparing how you're going to change, you still have to pay attention to the ways in which the system is continuing to change, because tomorrow's state is not going to be the state of today and then after that. So how do we, any advice you have or tips for people who work in that space of social change?
Another brilliant concept to dive into. So I think the first thing is, I was smiling as you're talking about art, because I'm diving into a project now too about this concept of art in a post-atrocity, post-genocide place, and the power of the humanities and art and language to not just bring us through, but to express the extent of healing and reconciliation, I think is incredibly important and can be under-focused on in places like political science. And then in terms of the systems, systems thinking generally underlies a lot of what I think about, and more importantly, perhaps how. And there's some incredible systems thinkers. And I think that this approach, something that I've kind of delved into very deeply, is incredibly important because it gives us two things. One, this concept that there's so many different levers to a system. And two, as you said, that we don't know all the levers of the system in time and space. And so for me, it kind of, again, when we're talking about this concept of complexity, and even in a scientific way, the role of uncertainty is incredibly profound and incredibly important. Because if you only have, if you have the blinders on, then there is only one way you can go, because you haven't even imagined that there is another place out there that you could go. And so in that way, interestingly, it can be incredibly dangerous and dogmatic to think you know all the answers. I always say, if you think you know all the answers, that's kind of the huge red flag, because it already tells you I'm not open to thinking any other way. And the best conversations also are the opposite of the transactional A to B. It's where we don't know where we're going to go, but we're going to meander there together. And so that's, I think, this concept of recognizing multiple levers, but also that we can't see them. It doesn't mean that they're not there. And so that's where this balance between knowledge and the profound importance of unlearning and understanding what we don't know, because that humility can be missing from things like a knee-jerk reaction. I mean, part of the problem with the online discourse is so knee-jerk. And it's so, and some of the best things are slow, tedious, unglamorous, unsharp, long form work that we have to do on ourselves and with others. And that's why when you ask people that in a peace process, in negotiation, these things can take a long, long time. But we do tend to live in, New York City, and it's America, and it's fast and it's innovative. And something about that is incredibly dynamic and exciting, but other parts of that, we miss out on what could be. And so I think that these are the systems thinking general. Donnell Meadows, these are the types of thinkers who I think have really had a profound effect on my and others' ability to kind of not just understand complexity, but to embrace it. I think, anything is a good example, like Walt Whitman talks about containing multitudes, that as a woman, for example, that we don't have to just be one thing. And we forget this sometimes because for so much of history and in many parts of the world now, that is, you had to be just a one thing. And so then we internalize that. And then the system also reminds us, I think the other thing the system does, and I'll stop here, is that it reminds us that no one of us has all the answers, and that it's so incredibly important to recognize we all have an essential role to play. One of the dangers of things like AI technology is that we're leaving our future up to, 5 tech titans that don't have our best interests in mind, because also they could never possibly inhabit all of who we are. I tell an example sometimes, of the automatic faucets you see everywhere now, airports, public spaces, anywhere, where you just put your hand under and it's touchless. Well, when they were first piloting those, they had no one in the room that didn't have pale skin. And so as a result, those systems, like a lot of photography systems, are not trained for skin that is not white. Just because there wasn't lived experience in the room to say you can be the smartest engineer, but you only have your experience. So there's something about making room for the vast experience that we all share. And I will also just say, of course, I come from a human rights perspective, but just from a problem solving perspective and economic perspective, that's how we get the best solutions and the best innovative products too.
Yeah, fascinating. And you don't know that until you experience that, which is a nice segue into one of our questions here. We're going to take questions now. How can we frame data and train AI algorithms to help us make strategic decisions to progress human rights without losing our human values? So I think it's very nice segue to what you were just saying.
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. Hello, thank you for that. This is one of the key issues, because we can have these lofty goals and ideas and this vision and these aspiration and this imagination, but we're also living in this world today. And it's not just a matter of the companies that are working today, but that we all have the realities that we face within a system where we need to get jobs. We need to figure out how to do those day-to-day things, right, just actually survive. And that's why I think it's also really important to step back and recognize, on the individual level, a lot of these things are difficult. So if we can't solve these problems, I think sometimes we're told, well, this is a you problem. we really have to lay the biggest responsibility at the biggest platforms and the people with the most kind of power. You can see this also with the environmental movement. These are things that some of our, power is critical here. And Brian Stevenson always says, those most proximate to the problems should be most proximate to the solutions. But in reality, that's not how it works, right? We have these big profit gaining models, and they're going to create value for their shareholders, which is going to create a very narrow silo. So if we're trying to combine the human values and human rights mechanisms within these tools, I will just say, I know it can feel really doom and gloom, but I cannot begin to describe to you that a few years ago alone, someone would come to me at a book event and say, not ask, but say, well, human rights and AI have nothing to do with each other. Okay, well, take a seat, sir. Like, we're going to go over this, but now this is not it. I mean, my students are the brightest people I know. The future leaders are asking the tough questions. We're nowhere near there yet, but we are doing the work. These are things I never thought would be accepted. And I was fighting, and others were fighting just to say, this is so existential for us. And now it's happening. So there is like so much hope, and these things are progressing. And so what I'll say to the answer to that question is, it's not just about what you see as the end product, because there's coding, there's programming, there's who's creating these technological tools as engineers. And then of course, things like an ethical approach to what people are learning in school. Like, there weren't ethics classes in engineering, for example. Those are just starting to happen, like those tactical tools. It's not just engineers, it's who's in leadership positions. Like you said, if women are afraid to run for office, we have a problem. In terms of VC funding, the numbers are so stark. Tiny percentages of projects being funded that are created by women. Tiny percentages. So opening up all those funding pipelines, opening up who is running for office, opening up spaces where people can feel like they have the opportunity to do things. And I always think about, for example, what we feel now is very new, but Gutenberg's printing press in the 1400s did something similar. Before, if you didn't read Latin, you could not access education. And it's only from the printing press that people like Leonardo da Vinci were able to read in their vernacular Italian at the time. So, we have some interesting things going on in language and who has access. A lot of these incredible AI tools, for example, are mostly available, like ChatGPT, in English. So we have some problems there. So for me, equity, agency, these are the types of things that undergird human rights framework that we can be using. But it starts small with whoever just asked that question, and really asking those questions in the workplace and at school, and in the ways that we can figure out. I think one way that I think about it is that, how can I pull out a chair, not just for myself or someone I know, but for someone whose voice I know is underrepresented? And that, I think, is that's one thing we can all be doing in these places, because recognizing that it's so incredible to have respect and love for all of us, and who's missing from this space, whose voice needs to be heard. Great question.
Yeah, so creating the diversity in the group, or the people who are coming together and forming the different things they're doing and creating things, because you may think you have an expansive way of looking at the world, but I can't say so many times, almost on a daily basis, perhaps, that somebody says something, I'm like, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way, or I hadn't looked at it that way. And I'm like, wow, and I'm in the business of looking at things multiple ways. So the whole idea about PAR, participatory action research, and really working with communities and working with people. Now, of course, the challenge, as we all know, is that the more diversity you have in a room, if you're not able to manage it, then it could also be very problematic. And then you're inadvertently silencing some voices. And we know lots of data around who gets to participate and how many times and how often. And when you make a suggestion, is your voice then followed up by somebody else's voice who gets recognized and not your own? And so lots of things about that.
Yeah, and tokenism. And like you said, if there's a space that doesn't feel comfortable for a certain, group of people, well, then that's not really a space at all. Yeah, I mean, updating all of those concepts are incredibly important, and thinking about inclusion and radical inclusion in different ways that we approach, because exactly, slapping a Band-Aid on any of this, or a name on any of this, without that true tedious work, just ends up creating a different set of problems. And then, worst of all, we say, oh, well, then that didn't work. Diversity doesn't work. We have to, right? So you get all, like, speaking of online, you get a backlash when the work actually wasn't done, because creating that space where we can all belong is a lifetime of work. And it requires an intentionality. I think you were describing it really well. That doesn't just include doing something to put a Band-Aid on it. It's really like, what does it mean to belong to each other? And how can we figure out celebrating our differences, but also coming together in a space where we can move forward? And we see political gridlock in a two-party system, and we see when things get very binary that we aren't able to move past that. And then things get really kind of scary from there.
Yeah, so being an educator, then of course I talk about the whole idea about education being life work and it's lifelong education. It doesn't have to be formal. It could be any informal education because we need to learn how to have the skills to talk and communicate across difference. We need to have the skills to communicate and be with people who are different from us. So somebody's asking you to repeat the Henry Ford quote. I think you talked about something with the horse.
Oh
horse
yeah,
and the-
and, right. Interpersonal issues of Henry Ford aside, the quote is, "If I had asked the people what they wanted, they would have asked for a faster horse."
Yeah, we
So
can
that,
only ask for what we know and what's in our frame of reference, like the
right,
car.
that
We were before the
becomes
car.
yeah, this thing that's been passed down that is said about what he said. But essentially the idea being, we're only thinking inside the box. We can't imagine that other thing that could be. And then of course, it's very complicated because what have cars done, for example, to the US, city landscape? These are not easy answers, but that is to say, I think also that there are things beyond our scope today, and having that humility to say there's something beyond what I can see right now.
Great. So another question is, this is such a great talk. Thank you. How do you think we can have a voice? How can we change the system, which right now favors private corporations with no regulations and does not value human rights or democratic decision making?
Yeah, this is it. No, thank you for that. This is profoundly difficult and profoundly frustrating because we also recognize, let's say we get the imagination, the education, the ideas, we're on fire, we're thinking about these new concepts, but we're still these frail human beings in this system. And, for me, I mean, there's two things. I think the first thing is, in my work, I mean, there will always be more war and there will always be more death and more destruction. And so I also understand deeply that my work is not for me or for anything I might see a few wins of a few battles, but my work will not be anything that I am able to solve in any way, or people that do this work, and that it's a generational concept of what you might leave behind, that torch for others to pick up. So that longer term thinking helps us recognize, because I think it can feel really hopeless. And why would I, all the time, why would I even vote? And so that type of, it's so real. If you're not afraid and anxious and depressed right now, it's like you're not even paying attention. I understand that. But at the same time, it's doing those things that over the long term, that tedious long term will create those changes, because you never know. I mean, I just said something, that I think about every day that someone said to me in passing. You never know. You do something, you say something, you produce a piece of art, you get a degree, you do a job, you say something to your kid, your friend, your colleague. You never know the ripples of what that's going to be. You can't really predict what's going to be that revolutionary critical mass. But you go down swinging no matter what. You try every day to do that thing that's going to create, some promise of something better. And I think that that's the one thing. The other thing is, as you just said, I mean, I can't tell you how much hope even that question gives me. We weren't asking these questions in this way with this fervor and this frequency before. I think it also, of course, it's hard because things feel so challenging and so ugly and violent in so many ways, which is very real. But we have to ask those questions, and that's kind of the beginning of figuring out how we change them. And I also think that it's really important that in this work, we don't save anyone. We don't save the world. We don't rescue anyone. That is not the work here. And the work is not to do everything. It's to be that tiny, tiny candle in the darkness that may or may not have some ripple of hope somewhere, somehow. And for me, there is no big or small work. That's the other critical thing. There is no big or small work anywhere, anytime. These are the cards I've been dealt. What can I do? This is the hand I've been given. How do I play it? That is the only question I have. I got dealt this hand. It can be a shitty hand, excuse me. It can be, a decent hand. How do I play the cards I've been dealt? And that's all we've got. And it gets so much more exciting and interesting when we're doing that for others and for the future generations who will be in the world around us. That's because I think also justice tipping points can happen when we are fighting for something that is not intricately connected to us, so we seem. That's the tipping point. Can I do this work for someone I've never even met? And that type of empathy building, as Beth, I'm sure it's a building a muscle. It's a practice. And every day you can get up and do something about it.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely building those muscles. And they say sometimes that just asking a question is an intervention because you're stimulating somebody to think in a way they hadn't. So we are at the end of our time, believe it or not. This just flew by. And I'm sorry, we're not going to get a chance to answer all the questions that were asked, but thank everybody for sending them in. So Flynn, what would you like to say as just a closing remark?
Wow. I'm inspired by what you just said and the questions, and I think what you said is so beautiful. And I wrote about this in the book. I mean, you have such a beautiful way of encapsulating this, but there's this concept called live the questions. And I think that, as you just said, sometimes just asking the question and living in the question and not being so quick to assume I'm right or this is the answer. And how do we constantly live the questions, I think is so incredibly important, because ultimately that's what our lives are. Again, and we're trained to think it's this LinkedIn bio, or it's this online interaction, or it's this knee-jerk reaction, or this extremist voice that I heard. But really, how do we learn to live our lives in a way over the vast scope that we could never see helps us ask those questions that maybe somehow, somewhere will be answered, and that along the way, no matter what, we learn to treat each other a little bit better. And I think it's not as glamorous or as quick as we might hope, but I do think that's where the magic happens. And I feel that in this space where we talk today and in the incredible questions that we got, that, we have to learn to kind of live in that very, very murky gray area of living those questions, and to learn to treat each other better no matter what.
Thank you so much. That's also beautiful. It's a wrap up. So I want to thank Flynn Coleman for being my guest today. I want to thank the SPS team for supporting this, and thank the participants for being here and being concerned about this topic and caring about it and asking those wonderful questions. Alrighty, thank you everybody for joining. Bye now.